Fantastic. So my name is Edoardo Palombo, and I'll be presenting policy uncertainty in Brexit UK. This is a joint project with Renato Faccini, also at the Queen Mary University of London. So a major contribution in the recent years in the macro literature has been the finding that uncertainty shocks have important consequences for the business cycle. In fact, these shocks are typically modeled as temporary increases in the variance of aggregate and idiosyncratic TFP shocks. Yet, not all episodes of uncertainty are alike, and not all are best represented by a shock to the second moment of the fundamentals in the short run. More recently, the world economy has been rocked by extraordinary examples of economic policy uncertainty, including the UK's decision to leave the EU, Brexit. Now, these dramatic cases of economic policy uncertainty can hardly be interpreted as conventional uncertainty shocks. Indeed, the introduction of such policies have permanent effects on the economy, which means that the uncertainty is primarily about aggregate and idiosyncratic fundamentals in the long run. Secondly, these policies only have a direct effect on the fundamentals once they've been implemented, meaning that this uncertainty does not have a direct effect on the fundamentals in the short run. And finally, an important aspect of this policy uncertainty is timing uncertainty, as it is the case that when these policies are announced, it is not known when these will be implemented, if at all. So in this paper, we develop a structural framework to study the effects of economic policy uncertainty, and then we carry out a quantitative analysis of Brexit. We build an heterogeneous firms model with investment adjustment costs in the spirit of Bloom 2009. Now, we model these policies as permanent aggregate and idiosyncratic shocks to the fundamentals. We assume that the economy will be hit by unexpected news that a policy may be implemented sometime in the future. Now, the type of policy that will be implemented will be uncertain, as is uncertain the direct effect of the policy on each firm, and the firms will not know when this policy will be implemented. In order to carry out the quantitative analysis on Brexit, we then use firm-level expectation data from the decision-maker panel dataset from the Bank of England in order to calibrate these Brexit policy parameters, assuming that there are two policy outcomes, soft and a hard Brexit. We then elicit the effects of the Brexit referendum by comparing dynamics under policy uncertainty to a case where the referendum never happened. So the calibrated model indicates that the losses of GDP associated with Brexit may be large. In fact, they can be as big as 7.6% in a hard Brexit scenario and 5% in soft. Now, the transitional dynamics under policy uncertainty reveal that the short-run effects of Brexit uncertainty are also quite big. In fact, we have a 5% fall in investment and a 0.4% drop in employment in the first year alone. And output only drops by 0.4% as fundamentals do not change in the first year until the policy is implemented. However, as this uncertainty drags on, what we see is that output will fall to 0.8%. And we will have two different channels working under this policy uncertainty. We will have the wait-and-see channel and the news channel. And what I will show you is that this wait-and-see channel will dominate the news channel. Another important feature of this experiment is that we have timing uncertainty, which plays a major role in the model. In fact, if uncertainty is expected to be more persistent, what we actually see is investment falling by less, as firms find it too costly to wait and see until the uncertainty is resolved. So moving on to the model, we have time that is discrete and in a horizon which is infinite, and we will be conducting a partial equilibrium analysis. We have a unit measure of heterogeneous firms which produce a final output good F using a Cobb-Douglas production function with decreasing returns to scale. The firms will hire labor at wage rate W, and they will accumulate capital, which depreciates at rate delta. Now, capital investment will be subject to non-convex adjustment costs, which comprise both of fixed and partial irreversibility. So what we can see is that firms will be characterized in the model by a four tuple of state variables. The first will be the idiosyncratic productivity A, which evolves in a normal AR1 fashion. Second will be an idiosyncratic policy state Z. Now this indicates how a firm will be affected by a policy in the future. So when the policy is implemented, the firms will face a one-time draw of Z. Now, with a probability Q+, this draw will be Z+, which indicates a positive idiosyncratic shock to the productivity of the firms. With probability Q-, there will be a negative idiosyncratic policy shock indicated by Z-, and neither with the complement probability. What is important to note is once that these shocks are drawn in the first period of the policy implementation, they will be permanent for these firms. So the stochastic process can be represented by the matrix gamma Z. The firms will also inherit capital from the previous period and will draw from a uniform distribution a fixed capital cost of adjustment Xi. Now, if firms want to adjust capital, they will have to pay a cost equal to W multiplied by Xi, where W is the wage, if they want to adjust the capital to the optimal level. If not, they can remain with their already accumulated capital. As a result, the joint distribution of firms can be summarized by mu. Now, we modeled the UK's decision to leave the EU as an unanticipated news of a future uncertain policy, Brexit. Now, let's assume the economy starts in a no-Brexit state. We have ZN denoting it. When the news hits, the economy transitions to the uncertainty state, ZU. Now, conditional on being on this uncertainty state yesterday, today we will transition to, we will leave the the EU with probability theta. With probability gamma R, the UK will remain in the EU forever and transition back into the no-Brexit state. And with the complement probability, the UK remains in this uncertainty state until next period. Now, conditional on the UK leaving the EU today, there are two options. There is a probability of having a soft Brexit, gamma S, and a complement probability of a hard Brexit, which we also interpret as a no deal. These Brexit states are absorbing Markov states, and this whole stochastic process can be represented in the transition matrix gamma Z. Now, the policy. After the policy of Brexit, in this case, is implemented, the returns to production of a firm are altered by a firm-specific shock, tau tilde. Now, this tau tilde is a function of idiosyncratic policy state, of the aggregate state, and of the idiosyncratic productivity. As we can see from equation 2, this shock has an aggregate component denoted by xj, which is state contingent on soft or hard Brexit, and an idiosyncratic component, which is state contingent on both the idiosyncratic state and aggregate state. Now, we allow this firm-specific shock to be nonlinear with respect to the firm's productivity, which will be key to matching the data that we have on Brexit, as firms that are more productive expect to lose more from Brexit. Now, the firm's problem is as follows. So the value of the firm at the beginning of the period is equal to the value of the firm for any given cost, any given fixed cost Xi. After the firm observes this adjustment cost Xi, it can decide whether to adjust its capital or not. If it adjusts its capital, it will pay a fixed cost and obtain VA. Otherwise, it will obtain VNA. What does this mean? It means that if the firm adjusts its capital, the payoff will be the maximized value of the production minus labor costs, and minus capital costs, which include this partial irreversibility, plus the continuation value. If, however, the firms decide not to adjust their capital, they will receive the maximized value of the production minus labor costs plus the continuation value, evaluated at the depreciated value of capital. So the data and calibration. So we have first the baseline calibration, where we calibrate the no Brexit steady states, and then we calibrate the policy. So just going in the interest of time quite quickly through this, here we have the no Brexit steady state calibrations, where these parameters are pretty much conventional in the literature, and we rely most on Bloom et al. In 2018 and Kahn and Thomas for the adjustment costs of capital. So for the Brexit calibration. Now, for the Brexit calibration, the model comprises of two sets of Brexit policy parameters. The first set determines the stochastic process of Brexit. This includes the per-period probability of exiting the EU, which also governs the timing uncertainty and the persistence of uncertainty in our model, as well as the probability of remaining in the EU and the probability of a soft Brexit, which govern the aggregate uncertainty. We then have the state contingent Brexit shocks, which can be subdivided into three sets: the aggregate policy parameters, the idiosyncratic policy parameters, and the idiosyncratic policy stochastic process. Now, in order to calibrate these 9 Brexit parameters, we rely on a novel data set by the Bank of England called the Decision Maker Panel dataset. Now, this is a firm-level survey data collected by the Bank of England and has a rotating panel of 3,500 firms that are representative of the UK business population. Specifically, this was built exactly to extract information about Brexit uncertainty. And these respondent firms, more specifically the CFOs, the decision makers of these respondent firms, provide probability distributions over 4 key elements: the expected long-term impact on Brexit on sales, the expected date of Brexit, the probability of remaining in the EU, and a probability of no deal. So what is our task here? We will then calibrate the policy stochastic process to match the firm expectations about the Brexit timing and the probabilities of each Brexit state. And then we will calibrate the state contingent policy to match the cross-section of expectations on sales. So here we have the calibration of the aggregate stochastic process. As you can see, there are 2 questions. The first asks the UK expected withdrawal date from the EU after any transition period. And the second one asks, what probability do you attach to a disorderly Brexit whereby a no deal is reached by the end of March 2019? Now, as I stated before, what these firms do when they receive this question is they attach a probability to each of these options. So the DMP, they then average these responses to provide us with the aggregate distributions that we see right here. So from table 2, we can work out the expected date of Brexit in order to calibrate the per-period probability of exiting the EU. We can also find out the probability of remain by looking at the never option in table 2. And we can then work out and calibrate the probability of remaining in each period into the EU. And finally, from the third table, we can aggregate this probability distribution to find out the average probability of a no-deal hard Brexit to calibrate the complement probability, or gamma S, of having a soft Brexit. Now, in order to calibrate the actual policy parameters of Brexit, we rely on 2 questions and 2 key moments. The first question asks about the expected impact of Brexit on sales, and the second one asks about the expected impact of a disorderly no-deal Brexit on sales. Now, whilst the first one is an unconditional question, the second one asks specifically about a no-deal scenario, enabling us to identify separately the parameters of a hard Brexit and ones of a soft Brexit. As we can see here in the data, firms attach quite a big probability to losses in any Brexit scenarios, specifically in a no-Brexit case. What we also do is discipline the parameters by adding the within firm standard deviation of sales expectations and the elasticity of expected sales to productivity. Now, this last moment is very key, as it shows that more firms, firms with more productivity, so more productive firms, expect higher losses or attach a bigger probability to losses after Brexit. And this is specifically informative on the parameter omega, which governs the nonlinearity of these firm-specific shocks. And these are the resulting calibration that comes from matching these moments. Now, please note that the model does actually quite well in matching these moments, and that the aggregate components of the policy parameters are relatively small, especially if we consider the idiosyncratic policy parameters, meaning that firms expect a widening of the distribution in any Brexit scenario. Now, on to the results. What we can do, first of all, is take these calibrated parameters and plug them into the model. And what we can see here, that in a soft Brexit scenario, we will have a 4.9% drop in output in steady state and 7.6% drop in hard Brexit steady state. Now, these large negative effects of Brexit are due to two reasons. First, firms just expect to lose more than to gain out of Brexit. And secondly, we have that more productive firms expect to lose more. Now, we can then evaluate the effects of the Brexit referendum by looking at the short-run effects of Brexit uncertainty. What we do here is simulate the dynamics, the transition dynamics under policy uncertainty, where Brexit is a stochastic process governed by the transition matrix gamma zeta and gamma z. We can then compare them to a scenario where the Brexit referendum never occurred and the UK remains in the EU forever and stays in this no-Brexit steady state. And here we have the results. So please note that the black line has no policy uncertainty, and it is the case when the economy never actually conducted the referendum and stayed in its status quo. The red line shows the transitional dynamics under policy uncertainty. And what we can see here is that at time one, the news of this potential implementation of Brexit hits the economy, up until the 21st quarter, when the economy is actually communicated that we will remain in the EU and cancel Brexit in all effect. So what we can see here is that the economy remains in this uncertainty state from period 1 to 21. What we can see here is the wait-and-see channel effect working. So we have an increase in the inaction in firms adopting a wait-and-see effect using inaction to basically decrease the aggregate investment, which means that labor and output drop by 0.4% in the first year. Now, as uncertainty drags on and we stay in this uncertainty steady state, what happens is that investment is still below its steady state value and actually decreases the capital stock, causing a decrease in output of 0.8%. However, this policy uncertainty shock really has two main effects. The first is a news channel, and the second one is what is more commonly known as an uncertainty channel. In blue here, we plot the transitional dynamics when we shut off this news channel. Now, the news channel is important because this news channel is about the firm's expectations. What we have is that when we are communicated that the UK might enable Brexit, the firms will have non-mean preserving expectations about the future because they will expect, on average, to converge to a steady state with lower capital. So by shutting off the uncertainty channel, meaning we shut off the adjustment costs, we disable and disengage the wait-and-see effect. And what we can see here is that from the news channel alone, what is created upon the shock hitting the economy is a sharp drop in investment, which then bounces back to its steady state in the next period. And this causes a one shock to output, labor, and capital up until the uncertainty is resolved. However, when we include also the uncertainty channel, as we did before, into the transitional dynamics, what we can see is that the wait-and-see effects actually propagates the initial shock to decrease the investment and decrease output, creating much larger effects than the news channel. Now, an important feature of this policy uncertainty is timing uncertainty. Now, if you remember the parameter theta, theta governs the persistence of this uncertainty, as it tells us, on average, how long we expect uncertainty to last and how long we should see the policy being implemented. Now, let's take a counterfactual scenario, where we have theta just for the sake of it, and see how the model behaves. When we have theta, what we effectively say to the economy is that we expect the uncertainty to last longer, as the per-period probability of Brexit is now lower. So on average, we expect a much higher persistence of uncertainty. So as this uncertainty, the persistence of this uncertainty increases, the freezing of investment to wait and see up until the outcome of the policy, what it results in is actually it results in the firms having to produce in a suboptimal way, which means, sorry, just lost my train of thought. So when this timing uncertainty increases the persistence of uncertainty, what it happens is that the firms are forced to produce in a suboptimal way if they wait and see. Meaning that when capital depreciates, they are forced to have a non-efficient scale of production. This actually decreases the value of the waiting options under uncertainty, causing investment to fall less. Now, just to conclude, the aims of this paper are to provide the framework to study the effects of policy uncertainty. We then take this framework to study in the effects of policy uncertainty in the context of the Brexit referendum and study how the Brexit referendum uncertainty has hit the UK economy. And we do this by using firm expectation data to inform the parameters on policy and policy uncertainty. What we have is that the results show that the long-term effects of Brexit are quite big. In fact, we have a output falling by 5% in soft Brexit and 7.6% in hard Brexit. And there is a short-run effect of the Brexit policy uncertainty, which causes an initial shock of 5% in investment and 0.4% in employment and output. And as uncertainty drags on, what we see is that employment falls by 8% due to these wait-and-see effects. Two key features of this model is that, first, the wait-and-see effects bite exactly when we are closer to the cliff edge. So as we can see in this slide here, the losses in output as we get closer to the cliff edge are actually maximized. And secondly, timing uncertainty has a key role. Indeed, if the uncertainty is more persistent, what we find is that firms find it too costly to wait and see, as they would have to produce in an inefficient manner if they were to wait and see until the result of the policy outcome. So investment actually drops by less than in the counterfactual scenario. Thank you very much.
Do we have any question?
Yes.
So when you model the short run, when you model the short run effects, you model it with essentially the UK deciding not to leave the European Union.
The counterfactual is that, yes.
At 21
Quarters, yeah, which is the average expectation date.
Have you done a similar exercise where you look at the short run effects and then, let's say, at 21 quarters, the UK leaves, and comparing the short run effects before versus the actual effects upon the implementation of leaving? And do you get the same short run uncertainty effects there?
So obviously the effects of this policy uncertainty decrease if we look at, for example, a soft Brexit simulation as we have here. This is the case in which the referendum is announced, and then at the 21st quarter, what we have is that the firms learn that there's going to be a soft Brexit, for example. No? Now, the black lines represent a counterfactual scenario whereby the firms actually know exactly when the economy is going to exit, is going to know exactly what type of policy, so they're definitely going to know about the soft Brexit, and they're going to know how idiosyncratically this soft Brexit will impact their productivity. So as we can see here, and it's clear on the output graph, is that although there are still effects of policy uncertainty, they are slightly muted if we compare them to the soft Brexit case scenario, and a little bit less if we compare them to the hard Brexit scenario. Yeah? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for having me. I'm Oliver Exton from the University of Cambridge, and today I'm presenting renegotiation of trade agreements and firm exporting decisions with evidence from the impact of Brexit on UK exports. This is joint work with Meredith Crowley and Lou Han, also of the University of Cambridge. So as a quick disclaimer, we use administrative data from HMRC in this project, and a standard disclaimer applies. So when we think about trade agreements, we know that these are very important for the world economy. 98% of global trade is covered by the largest trade agreement in the world, the WTO, whilst a further 60% or 60% of world trade is covered by further preferential trade agreements, such as NAFTA or the European Union. Now, countries regularly negotiate new, more liberal trade agreements, whether we think of this as the multiple rounds of the WTO, or whether we think of this as countries negotiating new or renegotiating preferential trade agreements, such as Canada and the EU, or the CPTPP. However, in the last couple of years, we've seen several trade agreements announcing a renegotiation with the threat that if those negotiations collapse, that this would lead to tariff increases. So trade deliberalization, whether we think of the UK leaving the European Union through Brexit, or President Trump's threats to withdraw the US from NAFTA. So this motivates our research question for this paper, which is, what is the impact of such a renegotiation where there's a threat that tariffs could potentially increase? And what's the impact of this uncertainty on firm entry into and firm exit from exporting? So we look at this question in the context of Brexit, where the decision of the UK to leave the European Union has generated considerable uncertainty around the future of the UK-EU trade relationship. In particular, in this paper, what we're going to do is we're first going to generate empirical predictions from a model of firm exporting decisions under trade policy uncertainty in the context of Brexit. Second, we're going to identify uncertainty across products from the threat point tariffs that UK firms would face to export to the European Union if future UK-EU trade was conducted under the EU's World Trade Organization commitments. And then we estimate what the impact of this trade policy uncertainty is on post-referendum export entry and exit of UK firms to the European Union from UK customs data. So to quickly summarize the results, the main results are that following the Brexit referendum, we find that UK exporters are less likely to start exporting and more likely to stop exporting products to the European Union that would face high tariffs under a World Trade Organization trade relationship. In particular, when we focus on products that would face extreme tariffs, which we define as greater than 15%, or high tariffs of between 10 and 15%, we find that the growth rate and entry declines by 22.4 percentage points and 13.2 percentage points, respectively. We also find that products that would face tariff rate quotas or specific duties also experience significant declines in the entry rate. We then ask, well, what do these estimates imply? And we perform a partial equilibrium aggregation exercise, and we estimate that entry into the European Union by UK firms would have been about 5% higher, and exit would have been about 6.1% lower in 2016 if there had been a guarantee that EU import tariffs on UK exports would have remained at zero post-Brexit. So to outline this talk, I'm briefly going to talk about the Brexit referendum and how we interpret it as increasing trade policy uncertainty for UK firms. Then I'm going to briefly discuss our empirical model and our data, and then show you the results. So, as I'm sure everybody in this room is aware, on the 23rd of June 2016, the British electorate voted to leave the European Union. In terms of the future of the UK-EU trade, the UK government announced that this would mean that the UK would attempt to leave the customs union, and the UK began negotiations with the EU with aims to ensure continued tariff-free access to EU markets. However, there is the outside option or threat point if no deal was reached, or if the UK decided that it wanted to trade with the EU under WTO terms, the UK exports to the EU would be charged the same external tariff rates as all other third countries in the World Trade Organization, so countries such as the US and China, and therefore the UK would face the EU's World Trade Organization tariff schedule under the most favored nation rules. So we exploit the Brexit referendum result as a natural experiment as a result of the unexpected outcome of the Brexit referendum. So here in this chart, I plot the expected probability of the UK leaving the European Union in the year leading up to the Brexit referendum. The key point to take away is that on average in the year running up to the Brexit referendum, the probability from the betting market, so these odds are taken from Betfair, was that there was about a 30% probability that the UK would actually vote to leave the European Union. So upon the realization of the Brexit result, this led to a discontinuous increase in the probability that the UK would actually leave the European Union. We exploit this discontinuous jump in the probability that the UK would potentially face these threat point tariffs in a difference in difference regression specification. So in terms of thinking about what the impact of this entry into this renegotiation regime will have on UK exporters, we apply Brexit to a model of firm exporting decisions under uncertainty taken from Hanley and Lamau 2017. In the paper, we go into this in more detail. I'm not going to have time to do that today. But the key element of the model is that during a renegotiation regime, there is a probability that the UK would face the threat point tariffs as defined by the EU's WTO tariff schedule, which is equal to the probability of a no deal, or the probability that the UK opts to trade with the EU under WTO terms. There's also a probability that the UK would continue to face tariff-free access after the UK actually leaves the European Union. So what does this then do? Well, it means that UK exporters face an increase in the expected mean level of tariffs that they would face to export to the European Union in the future, which is going to lower the expected returns of exporting. It also generates a pure risk effect for for UK exporters, which means that UK exporters are more likely to want to wait and see, which is a result of an increase in the real option value of waiting. So from the model, we then take that into empirical predictions. In terms of entry, we predict that products facing higher threat point tariffs, so higher tariffs under trade with the EU under WTO terms, will experience decreased entry during the renegotiation relative to products facing lower threat point tariffs. So as I said, this is because those are the products that will face higher tariffs, so therefore UK firms both have a lower expected return to exporting, but also have this increase in the value of waiting. We also generate predictions in terms of firm exit, where in the model, firms face an exogenous probability of exiting from exporting into a market in any period, but then face the option to re-enter into the market. What this then means is it means we get similar predictions where for products facing higher threat point tariffs, firms are more likely to exit, which in the model operates through firms choosing not to re-enter during the renegotiation relative to products facing lower threat point tariffs. The two predictions on entry and exit then combine to give the result that therefore products facing higher threat point tariffs will experience a fall in the number of exporters during the renegotiation relative to the number of products, relative to products facing low threat point tariffs. In terms of our empirical model that we choose to run, we employ a difference in difference strategy, but regress the growth rate of entrants in a product H in time period T relative to the number of entrants in the period before on the threat point tariffs of a product H in time period T. So essentially, we're just running the growth rate in entrants on the threat point tariff of products across all of the products that UK exporters export to the European Union. We then also estimate similar models for exit and for the number of exporters. In additional results, we also include additional controls for the sensitivity to the exchange rate, and we also control for potential global product demand shocks and supply chain shocks through a triple difference specification. So thinking about the data that we can use to estimate this model, we turn to administrative data on the UK customs data. This is sourced from HMRC, from the Overseas Trade Statistics. This covers the near universe of customs transactions for UK firms, and in particular provides this information at the firm, product, destination, and time level. So what we're able to identify here is we're able to identify UK firms that export to the European Union in each year, as well as the value of exports that they're exporting. This then also allows us to identify when firms enter into exporting to the European Union, which we define as a firm exporting in a given year when they haven't exported to the European Union in the year before. We also provide additional robustness specifications in the paper where we also expand our definition of entry to firms who've not exported for 2 years or not exported for 3 years to the European Union to capture the idea of whether firms are just choosing not to re-enter following this shock, or whether this is firms actually making their first decision to enter into the European Union. Similarly, we also define exit from exporting to the European Union as when a firm isn't exporting in a given year, when it has exported in the previous year. So in terms of what do we find when we look at the administrative data, well, we find that in 2016, UK firms exported about 140 billion, sorry, that should be billion there, not pounds. Brexit hasn't hit that hard yet. Export about 140 billion pounds of exports to the European Union. That accounts for about 380,000 firm product exporters. So when we define exporters in this paper, we're defining it at the firm product level, so the CN8 product level. We also see considerable churn in the data as well. So we see that there's about 100,000 firm product entrants in each year in the data that we look at, and about 80 to 90,000 firm product exiters. So there's considerable churn in each period, but we're going to look at how that churn has changed across products in response to the Brexit vote. In terms of how we define trade policy uncertainty, there we go and we use information on the tariff rates that UK exporters would face under the EU's WTO tariff commitments. So here we define our threat point tariffs according to the current applied tariffs by the European Union on trade with third countries under the WTO. And then we also, in our analysis, classify products into discrete tariff categories. So we're going to run our analysis both using continuous tariff measures as well as discrete tariff measures. So in terms of the different categories that we have two categories which capture specific duties or quotas. So these are tariff rate quotas in terms of when there's a product that for a certain quantity of imports into the European Union, there's a particular tariff rate or a particular limit to the amount of products that can be imported into the European Union. They're primarily focused in kind of the food and drink sectors. In particular, animal products typically face considerably high numbers of quotas in each product. We also define specific duties, which are non-ad valorem duties. Again, these are primarily focused in the food and food sectors. We then define extreme tariffs, as I've already mentioned, as tariffs of over 15%. This is a relatively small share of products and affects a relatively small share, only 1.8% of our firm product exporters. We then also define high tariffs as between 10 to 15%, medium tariffs as 5 to 10%, low tariffs of 0 to 5%, and zero tariffs obviously as zero. So whilst we see that the vast majority of products would face primarily these medium and low tariffs as well as zero tariffs exporting to the European Union, we can see that a considerable share of exporters, 12%, would face high tariffs. In particular, I think there's been a lot of attention that this would include the car sector in the UK, where car exports from the UK to the EU would face 10% tariffs. So quickly showing what this looks like when we consider across lots of different industries, we can see that there's some industries like textiles where there's a large number of firm product exporters that would face high tariffs, but that actually a lot of these high-risk tariffs are spread over multiple industries. When we then look at export value, we can see that the distribution changes slightly, in particular focusing on the transport sector where we can see the high value of car exports from the UK to the European Union that would face these high tariffs under WTO trading terms. So moving on to our regression results, as I've already mentioned, in terms of our main findings, we find that products that would face high threat point tariffs experience reduced entry and increased exit relatively to industries facing low or zero tariff increases under a WTO trade agreement. And then we provide multiple robustness checks to control for the exchange rate movement that also occurred at the same time during the Brexit referendum and controlling for supply shocks or global demand shifts. So moving on to our main results, here we're regressing the growth rate of the stock of exporters, entrants and exiters on the threat point tariffs that products would face under a WTO trade deal. We can see that in line with our empirical predictions, we do find that there is a reduction of growth rate for products that would face higher threat point tariffs, a reduction in the growth rate of entrants for products that would face higher threat point tariffs, and an increase in the growth rate of exiters for products that would face high threat point tariffs. In terms of how to interpret these coefficients, well, products that would face a 10% threat point tariff would have 10.5 percentage points lower growth rate of entry into exporting than the implied 8.1% growth rate of entry of the zero tariff group emphasized by the constant. So this would imply an overall growth rate of minus 2.4% for those products. We can also see that products facing quotas and specific duties are also negatively affected by the increase in trade policy uncertainty. In particular, the growth rate of entrants is negatively affected by both the specific duty and the quota. So then breaking down our continuous tariff measure into the discrete tariff categories, we can see that most of these effects that we find in our main results are driven by the extreme and high threat point tariff categories. So these are, as I mentioned, tariff categories or products that would face tariffs of 10 to 15% or 15% or more. So here we find that products facing extreme threat point tariffs, so tariffs of over 15%, experienced a 22.4 percentage point decline in relative entry compared to products that would face zero tariff under no deal or under a WTO trade deal. So then we consider, well, what does this mean in terms of the aggregate impact? So using our results from the previous regression that I just showed you, where we use the discrete tariff categories, we're able to perform a partial equilibrium aggregation exercise where we use those regression coefficients and our statistics on the number of firms in each product category at the firm product level. And when we aggregate over the categories, we find that 5,344 firm products did not enter into the EU in 2016 relative to the counterfactual of no tariff increase in 2016. We then say, well, what does that mean in terms of the value of exports that have been lost as a result of this trade policy uncertainty? If we use the average value of entrants in 2015, then this reduced entry accounts for a relatively small £201 million of lost export value in 2016. If we take a kind of upper bound in terms of the lost export value where we use the average value of exporters in 2015, then this would imply a £1.5 billion loss of export value in 2016 as a result of this trade policy uncertainty. We then perform a similar exercise for exit, and when we combine the two results, we find that the total missing export value using the average value of entrants and the average value of exiters would be 394 million. If we use our upper bound estimate using the average value of exporters, this would be £3 billion of lost export value. So is this large? And why haven't we seen this in the aggregate statistics? Well, if we think back, the total value of exports from the UK to the European Union was only 140 billion, or was 140 billion in 2016. So these numbers are relatively small in terms of the impact on total export value. However, I think it is concerning when we think about the number of firm products that we're considering here and the short time period that this has occurred in following the Brexit referendum. So we then consider, could our results be driven by anything else? So in particular, immediately after the Brexit vote, sterling depreciated by 15%. So we ask, are our results driven by UK exporters responding to this depreciation? So to do this, we estimate exchange rate pass-through of the change in unit values of UK exporters to movements in the exchange rate to the European Union between 2012 and 2015. We then take these estimates at the two-digit HS2 industry level, and we include them as additional regressors in our main regression. So the idea here is that this will capture the sensitivity of the price of UK exports across different industries in response to exchange rate movements. We therefore expect that industries which are more sensitive in terms of their unit values to the exchange rate would have seen an increase in entry into the European Union and a decrease in exit as a result of the depreciation of sterling in 2016. So when we include this additional control, we do find those results in terms of the sensitivity to the exchange rate, but we also find that this doesn't seem to affect our main results of the impact of trade policy uncertainty. So although it does seem that UK exporters did respond to the depreciation of sterling, this isn't driving our main results in terms of the trade policy uncertainty. The second robustness exercise that we perform is we consider, are UK firms responding to anything else? So are they responding to either global product demand shifts, or are they responding to potential supply chain impacts of Brexit, or the expectation of future supply chain impacts of Brexit? Here we say, well, those would be common to both the EU and non-EU market. So as we assume that trade policy uncertainty hasn't increased to non-EU markets, especially because the UK government was saying that they would attempt to roll over all of the existing trade agreements, we can then employ a triple difference specification where we regress the difference between the growth rate of entry to EU markets relative to the growth rate of entry to non-EU markets on the same threat point tariffs. So when we perform this triple difference specification, we find that our results in terms of the stock of exporters and our results on entry are robust to controlling for these global demand shifts or cost shocks on the supply side. And in fact, we even see a slight increase in the magnitude of the coefficients. So we interpret that as this potentially implying that maybe firms are starting to employ trade deflection, so moving from the European market to non-European markets in response to the increase in trade policy uncertainty. The final thing that we do is, so far, we've taken all of our results comparing 2016 to 2015. We then exploit the fact that our data is at a more granular time period level, and we're able to compare the period of 2016 immediately after the Brexit referendum to the same period in 2015, so July to December. When we repeat the results there, we continue to find our main result on the impact of entry, and when we run the discrete tariff categories, we see similar results also on the stock of exporters and the growth rate of exiters. So we take that as this is the trade policy uncertainty around the Brexit referendum, and we confirm that by performing a placebo test where we run the same specification in the period before the Brexit referendum, where we think that the increase in trade policy uncertainty was much lower. Here, certainly on the tariff rate, we find no significant impact of threat point tariffs in the period before the Brexit referendum, which we take as further evidence that we are capturing an increase in trade policy uncertainty as a result of the Brexit referendum. So to quickly conclude, in this paper, we're the first paper to look at the impact of a renegotiation of a trade agreement with the threat that trade policy uncertainty could increase as a result of tariffs increasing as a result of the renegotiation. We then estimate what the impact of this has been through the natural experiment of the leave vote of the Brexit referendum. We find that firm entry into the EU has significantly declined for those products facing higher threat point tariffs, even though there's been no change to applied tariffs in the period that we study. We find that these magnitudes are economically significant and indicate a rapid response of exporters to the trade policy uncertainty. Overall, we find that entry would have been 5% higher and exit would have been about 6% lower in 2016 if UK firms had been guaranteed zero tariffs on exports to the European Union following Brexit.
Do we have any question?
Yep, Russell. So that's something that we're going to look into. We've not done it yet. Yep, Peter.
So your results are very persuasive for the effect on the extensive part of the number of exporters. But then you, if I understood you correctly, gross those up
So in terms of, we thought about what the predictions would be on the intensive margin. It's maybe not clear because if you're a firm expecting tariffs to increase in the future, maybe you would try and increase your sales today and try and shift intertemporally to actually get those sales today before the tariff increases in the future. So we weren't exactly sure what the predictions would be on the intensive margin. I think they're also complicated by the depreciation as well. So in particular for goods that are priced in euros, they're going to have an immediate increase in terms of the sterling value. So when we repeated our results on the intensive margin, we found insignificant effects. And we kind of take that as kind of this ambiguous effect. And we don't have quite the same strong predictions from the model of firm exporting decisions because it doesn't involve the same sunk cost of entry. But again, it's something that we're going to keep exploring. Yes?
So you're looking at the effect of the referendum. What about calling the referendum in the first place? Because basically, until the referendum has been announced, the probability of Exton would be presumably zero. Then you show it jump to something like 30%. Did that have an effect as well?
So we haven't looked at other periods before. I think it was known that there was likely to be a referendum from as early as the 2015 general election. I think that was kind of promised by the Conservative Party. But we don't have any information on the probability before that. So we can see that from the year before it's at 30%, but there's no betting data on any period before that. So we're not convinced that there's as clean a natural experiment as the period after. There has been some work done by Carl Hanley and Nuno Lamau in the US, they're both in the US, looking at the impact of changes in the probability leading up to the referendum and the impact of that on trade flows. So there has been some work done on that. Yep. We'll definitely look at the other points. Yep.
So, have you considered a point that when increase for firms trading to EU declines, does it lead to the corresponding increase into non-EU? Sector. So I'm also with stop trading with EU, maybe stopping with the non-EU countries, right? So that is there a possibility like that?
So we do start to explore that with our triple difference specification. When we just run the results with the non-EU, we find insignificant effects. So it doesn't seem that in at least the period that we're studying, that we do have that trade deflection actively working, but we do think that it's something that we would start to expect in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Mustapha Douch, and today I'm presenting this paper with my co-author, Edoardo. And I would like also to thank Christian Seger for its contribution toward the first draft of this paper. So the outline of this presentation will follow. we first way will try to motivate and eventually give a kind of introduction to the topic, and eventually we'll be presenting some kind of literature related to the paper, and eventually we'll be discussing our main methodological approach, and finally we'll be discussing the key result. So what we're interested here is basically to understand the potential impact of the policy uncertainty on the UK's trade patterns, to some extent following what Oliver has maybe done, but from a kind of aggregate perspective. In particular here, we consider like the Brexit referendum shock to be a kind of a classic announcement shock, in the sense that has affected mainly the economic system of the UK, and therefore we try to investigate what is its implication on trade. To do so, we basically use the so-called synthetic control method, where we make the assumption that the main treatment is actually on the UK economy, and therefore we try to investigate what are the potential implications on trade patterns. Here, in particular, we consider the result of exit poll to be a kind of major shock, and this shock basically, as I said earlier, is basically affecting the economic system of the UK. There might be some other effect in terms of other countries being affected. However, we believe that the highest effect in terms of those Brexit uncertainty might be on the UK. This is basically considered to be a kind of announcement shock, in the sense that no formal Brexit has happened yet, and I'm sure, as you know, the actual timing of Brexit has been delayed, leading to some kind of aggregate uncertainty, which is affecting the economy, trade from one hand, and other macroeconomic effects. Here I have just a graph, as Oliver has shown, where we have basically the probabilities of Leave campaign winning the election compared to Remain, and exactly as has been anticipated, we basically consider the result of the referendum to be a kind of natural field experiment, as the prediction were completely wrong, in the sense like the Leave campaign wasn't supposed to actually win the election. And therefore, we consider this shock to be mainly a kind of exogenous shock, a natural field experiment, which has to some extent affected the economic system. And therefore, we try to exploit those exogeneity of the shock to understand the implication on trade. In fact, as you might already know, the immediate effect of the actual result was a sharp decline in the exchange rate, and the sharp decline in exchange rate of the sterling versus other currencies, and especially in the sterling-US exchange rate, as well as sterling to euro. And they have remained fairly low since the actual referendum result. And therefore, the implication on this is that we may actually try to understand that the potential implication of Brexit referendum, or the overall uncertainty on the economy, can actually be summarized to be two main real market effects. One is coming from the real exchange rate, the other is coming from GDP. For what concerns the expectation in terms of this macroeconomic variable is the fact that the effective exchange rate will lead eventually to a higher eventually export volume, due to the fact that domestic prices are becoming relatively cheap due to the devaluation of sterling, and therefore we are expecting an increase in trade volumes, although there might be some time lag, but at least we are expecting an increase in exports. On the other hand, due to the fact that there has been a kind of depreciation of exchange rate, we will expect the imports, on the other hand, to be relatively low, given the fact that foreign prices are becoming higher, and therefore that will have an impact on how much we're able to eventually buy from foreign markets. The other effect eventually is on the GDP, and actually what has been shown is the fact that the policy uncertainty has had a kind of negative effect, whether you are actually considering a kind of soft Brexit or a hard Brexit. Indeed, there has been studies from Zwatidingra et al. And others, which they have shown that using a kind of general equilibrium framework, the implication of soft Brexit and hard Brexit is still negative. Bank of England has to some extent confirmed those results, as well as, for instance, other studies that have used a similar approach of ours, Born et al., and that they've shown that just a quarter post-referendum result, the UK GDP was already 1.3% lower compared to pre-referendum result. Of course, if the country or the economy is relatively poorer, it has also implication on how much they can buy, and therefore implication on imports. Traditionally, if you want to understand what are the implications of on trade flows, usually international trade literature use somehow gravity model, gravity equation to understand the implication of different policies. And this has been shown to be a kind of rigorous toolkit to actually provide a causal relationship and therefore policy recommendation. One of the problems, however, here is the fact that when you start having somehow policy uncertainty, anticipatory effect, then the gravity model are to some extent less reliable to provide a potential causal effect. And therefore, in fact, as Freund and McLaren have shown, for instance, countries, when they start joining a particular bloc, firms or eventually the economy, especially businesses, they start having some kind of adjustment or anticipatory effect in the sense beforehand, before joining the actual bloc, because of potential sunk cost investment, anticipatory sunk cost investment. And therefore, the implication is that anticipatory effect might lead to some extent some implication on trade flows. There are also theoretical papers such as, for instance, like Harlan-Limau, which they have provided that policy uncertainty, on the other hand, has as well a kind of policy implication, and in the sense that what they show is basically one US and China joining the WTO 2001 WTO agreement. This has had a huge implication in terms of on prices as well as on trade because of policy uncertainty. And they have estimated that the policy uncertainty was at least had the kind of an equivalent reduction on tariff reduction of at least 13%. And therefore, because of all these issues, in terms of both anticipatory effect and uncertainty, understanding and using the gravity model is less reliable than, for instance, less reliable in providing potential causal relationship in case of policy uncertainty or in case we have anticipatory effects. In fact, even another study from WTO has shown that policy uncertainty can have anything between 1.7 to 8.7% tariff equivalent. And therefore, those is relatively high magnitude, and it has a huge implication, therefore, on both on trade and as well as in the aggregate economy. There have been other studies which they have shown the effect of, for instance, of decolonization or, for instance, breaking up with ex-colonies, joining or post-Sovietic breakups. However, majority of these studies, for instance, they don't consider a potential effect of a policy uncertainty or anticipatory effect, which need to be taken into account. I think one of the exceptions here is the paper from just Oliver has presented, which I think were one of the first attempts to actually include those policy uncertainty in a framework and trying to investigate potential causal relationship. Generally, I think the kind of literature can be summarized in those two blocks. We have eventually Brexit literature and trade policy under uncertainty. And there has been quite substantial work in both literature, but the main conclusion is that policy uncertainty have effect on the economy. For what concerns our main methodological approach, we use the synthetic control method, and this approach has been initially developed by David Carr to assess the causal relationship in a comparative case study. This approach has been eventually then, to some extent, sophisticated by Aberdi and Garzabal, which they try to investigate the implication of terrorist conflict in the Basque region, and they show that a region that they had terroristic conflict, they have seen at least 10% lower GDP per capita compared to region without conflicts attacks. In terms of more recent paper that they use this method, we have SIA 2017, which has investigated, for instance, the impact of the UK not joining the euro, and even in that particular case, they show that the effect was negative. We have Born et al., which has investigated the effect on GDP per capita, or the effect eventually of exchange rates. So what are therefore the research question of this paper? Well, what we're looking here is to investigate what are the effect of the Brexit referendum upon the UK export, and in particular whether there has been a kind of onward shift to the demand curve for exports, or whether this shift in demand curve of export there has been any difference between the EU versus non-EU, and in particular whether these effects are actually short-lived or eventually long-lasting, and finally whether those results hold also when we consider imports. We try to investigate, therefore, those questions by using the synthetic control method. What we observe in our database? Well, we have a kind of bilateral trade flow of country pairs. Basically, suppose we have a bilateral flow between UK and Germany with subscript I from a pool of countries, country pairs, indexed by X. In our specific case, we have for the EU case, we have 14 countries for a total of 91 country pairs. We denote basically with XT the traded group, basically UK versus the rest of the EU, and eventually the control group X and T, basically the bilateral trade flow between EU countries. For instance, Italy versus Spain, France versus Germany, which are not necessarily being affected by the Brexit referendum, and therefore to some extent can be considered to be a control group or non-treated group. In particular, if we take into consideration one particular flow, say, for instance, UK versus Germany, and we define it as bilateral trade flow of a time t between GBR and the EU, which is basically a standard international classification of the two countries, as the traded bilateral flow, we would like to compare this bilateral trade flow with an untreated bilateral trade flow of similar characteristic, the so-called bilateral trade flow between UK and Germany, which has not been treated by the referendum result. If we have such counterfactual, then we should be able eventually to calculate an aggregate loss or gain due to the policy uncertainty. And therefore, we can define an aggregate gain or loss in this following definition, where we observe the bilateral trade flow as a percentage loss or gain from the untreated bilateral trade flow. One of the key limitations, however, here is the fact what we choose as a counterfactual. If we choose, for instance, any other pair, suppose France, Germany as a counterfactual for Germany, UK, if we do manually this, if we select manually this counterfactual, there are of course some kind of econometric issues such as selection bias. So we can't just select any alternative bilateral trade flow from the control group as a potential counterfactual. So we need to find a way to have, for instance, a kind of bilateral trade flow which very much resembles the treated bilateral trade flow, and therefore calculate the aggregate gain or loss. Here comes, therefore, the synthetic control method, which uses a kind of algorithm that that builds basically this counterfactual as a weighted average from the pool of untreated countries, and therefore by this algorithm is able to calculate this counterfactual. And once we have this counterfactual, we will be able then to calculate the aggregate gain or loss due to policy uncertainty. One of the limitations, however, if we just do a kind of simple synthetic control method, is the fact that we will have eventually one counterfactual and one bilateral trade flow, actual bilateral trade flow. And therefore, for statistical inference, is not enough to actually provide potential implication of the policy uncertainty. To avoid, or at least to overcome this challenge, we have to rely on alternative statistical robustness check, which is basically adopting a kind of subsampling method of Politis and Romano, which basically what it does is randomly select 6 different counterfactual groups from the pool of control group, and therefore we draw basically a kind of 10 countries from the initial sample size, and therefore we try to build, to some extent, a distribution of counterfactual, and by building a distribution of counterfactual, we are able then to actually have a potential confidence interval from which we are able to derive the potential gain or loss due to a policy uncertainty or the Brexit referendum in our case. By doing this, therefore, in our case, we selected, for instance, a distribution of 500 counterfactual, and therefore we are able to calculate an average aggregate gain or loss due to the referendum result. Our sample uses a monthly database. Basically, it's IMF dots for bilateral trade flow from 1999 to March 2018. One of the characteristics of this methodological approach is the fact that it requires the data, the panel data, basically to be, to some extent, balanced, and therefore, because of that issue, we have to drop, for instance, some countries, such as, for instance, Turkey, Indonesia, and small other number of other countries, and therefore we try to some extent limit this by eliminating as less as possible to avoid any potential selection bias. For a small percentage of countries, they had basically missing data, and we tried basically to overcome that missing data by filling the gap. This is, however, relatively for a small fraction of countries, less than a half percentage point, and we basically filled those gaps by a kind of mirroring approach. If one party reports export, we try to replace imports from export to imports from the other part. And therefore, in this way, we are able basically to balance our database to carry out our analysis. We use, for instance, like seasonally, non-seasonally adjusted data, and the result still doesn't change much, for instance, whether you are using a seasonal adjusted or non-seasonal adjusted data. We use other eventually gravity model variables to account for potential multilateral resistance, GDP, bilateral exchange rate, distance, and any other variable to account for potential potential bias or omitted variable bias. In terms of the result, so what do we have here is, for instance, the result for the pre-referendum and the result for the post-referendum. What do we see here is that the pre-referendum result, the actual percentage difference between actual bilateral trade flow and our synthetic Britain is almost nil. In this sense, we are not able even to distinguish the true flow, and therefore the the distribution of counterfactual we have is very much resembling the actual bilateral trade flow. However, in the post-referendum period, what do we see is that, first of all, we report the result breaking down by 3 periods, for the whole period, for the first 6 months, and then after January 2017. And what do we see is that the export value in these circumstances are still have a huge decline, or at least they are at least 15% lower compared to what might have been in the scenario, for instance, of without the Brexit referendum. Just to have a kind of a graphical approach of the same thing, as you can see here, we are not able to distinguish, for instance, the synthetic Britain versus the actual bilateral trade flow. However, post-referendum, we see that, for instance, the actual has underperformed compared to the synthetic, or the a weighted average from the other counterfactual. And therefore, this resulted in a way to conclude that the Brexit referendum has had, from this alternative perspective, a kind of negative effect on the export values. When we look at the bilateral trade flow with a single partner, generally what do we see? We see that, for instance, the highest magnitude is with Greece, with Luxembourg. The lesser is basically with Germany and Austria. But generally what we see is that more or less all countries or bilateral trade flow to some extent have been affected. When we look at, for instance, the case of UK non-EU, again, the pre-referendum, the main difference, the percentage difference between the two flows is almost nil. However, the post-referendum, we see that this has been affected by at least 13%. So to conclude that the policy uncertainty, they had a negative effect on trade values. When we look at, for instance, at the case, this is just basically a graphical approach of the same thing. And again, the effect of actual bilateral flow was underperforming the actual synthetic Britain. When we look at the result, for instance, by single trader partner, we basically see that the main effect is coming from, when we distinguish, for instance, between Commonwealth plus Hong Kong and the rest of the world, we see that, for instance, from China, the actual trade flow has actually increased. Same for Korea. Less evidence is provided by Mexico. However, generally, all the other bilateral trade flow have seen a kind of negative effect. We carry out some kind of sensitivity test by potentially using potential implication for exchange rate because of devaluation, and therefore trade volumes might take time to adapt to depreciation of exchange rate. However, even in these circumstances, for instance, there has been a kind of moderation when we take into account the exchange rate effect. However, the effect is still quite high, around minus 12.7% lower compared to pre-crisis period. What is more interesting, I think, as we don't find much evidence in terms of UK, EU imports, in the sense that the actual difference is almost negligible, what do we see as more striking is the effect of, for instance, UK non-EU imports. Although in aggregate there has been a kind of a decline on aggregate, what do we see is that when we look at a single bilateral trade flow, we see that there might have been a kind of diversion of imports towards Commonwealth countries versus the rest of the world. And this may be saying that to some extent businesses, they have been deviating their imports toward Commonwealth compared to the rest of the world. We carried out a number of robustness checks, for instance, as I said earlier, seasonal adjusting or non-seasonal adjusted data, a falsification test, both, for instance, assigning Brexit to a different time period, a falsification test which basically assign Brexit to another country, including exchange rate, excluding some particular country that might be driving the data, using, for instance, non-European countries as a counterfactual for EU-UK relationship. But in all these circumstances, what we see is a negative implication of policy uncertainty on trade. And therefore, this led us to the conclusion that export to EU and non-EU would have been anything but higher than, for instance, at least 13 to 15% higher if the UK has not voted to leave. This has had implication on imports, and eventually we have seen that there might have been some kind of redirection or deviation of imports toward Commonwealth countries. And thank you.
Okay.